Good afternoon. I'm Rod Hicks. I'm journalist on call for the Society of Professional Journalists. This is the last in a series of webinars that we've done for college students on the topic of media distrust. We've been talking about the problem of people not trusting the media, and today we're going to talk about some of the things that we can do to try to rebuild trust. Today's session, well, all of the sessions, are sponsored by the Trust Project, which is a consortium of top news companies led by award-winning journalist Sally Lehrman that's developing transparency standards to help you easily assess the quality and credibility of journalism. For more than 2 years, Trust Project researchers interviewed people in the United States and Europe to find out what's important to them when it comes to news. What they found out is that people want to know who wrote or produced the story, what expertise they have, and whether the publisher has an agenda. Lehrman invited top news leaders around the world to build a digital standard that meets people's needs. That standard is known as trust indicators, which are standardized disclosures about a news organization's ethics and other standards for fairness and accuracy, a journalist's background, and the work behind a news story. To learn more about the Trust Project, go to thetrustproject.org. Right now, I will introduce to you the people who will be joining the discussion today. If you have questions for them, please write them in the Q&A. First, I want to introduce to you Dr. Sue Robinson. She's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Sue, can you tell us a little more about what you do?
Sure. I study and teach about digital technologies, and particularly how power it gets dispersed into information flows through social platforms. And so I had a book that came out a couple years ago, which was really about how people talk about race in public places, particularly journalism.
Okay. And we also have Sunnie Clahchischiligi, and she is a PhD student at the University of New Mexico. She also teaches there and is a freelance journalist. Sunnie, will you tell us a little more about you and your work?
Yes, my name is Sunnie Clahchischiligi, and I am from the Navajo Nation, and I am a PhD student at the University of New Mexico in rhetoric and writing. And I'm also a composition teacher, so I teach composition entry level and in the 200 level, I guess. And I'm also a sports writer turned investigative journalist for Searchlight New Mexico, an investigative organization out of Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Great. And finally, we have Mark Russell, who is the executive editor of the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, a newspaper there in a town that I love.
Thanks again for inviting me, Rod, and I appreciate the chance to be on this panel. Of course, I'm executive editor in Memphis, part of the Gannett newspaper chain and part of the Tennessee network of news organizations. And this topic is one that's very much in my mind because in Memphis, we have a coverage area that's about half African-American. One of the very few coverage areas in the nation where half of the folks who are in our market are African-American. It presents particularly a challenge for us in terms of the credibility of our coverage and building trust in that community. And also, we also are in Memphis, we're a blue dot in a ruby red state of Tennessee. So it also is a particular challenge for us in terms of having folks that surround us who tend to be more Republican than the city itself, and having people presume that we are fake news because they hear that from their leader, the President of the United States.
Well, when we started this project, the very first session was an overview of what the problem is that we're trying to address today. And the Knight Foundation and Gallup did a survey. They do it every year. And back in the 1970s, when they did this survey, it was looking at the degree to which people trust the news media. Back in the 1970s, it was around 70% in the mid-70s. Last year, 45%. That's how we're falling from among the public as to how they view the credibility of the press. There are many reasons for that. We've talked about those reasons through these webinars. And we'll highlight some of that again today. It'll come up. But we want to focus on what can we do to improve the trust that we have among our readers and viewers and listeners. As you all know, and I hope as the students know who are watching, the press plays a very important role in our democracy, particularly its watchdog role. That is, being the person to keep build the institution to keep an eye on government activities and to let you know what's happening by the people who you entrust to represent your interests. So there are a lot of problems out there. Let's just start off what is the biggest problem and how can we address that? I'm going to start off with Sue.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of thoughts while you were talking about this distrust, because I think that we need to recognize that a lot of communities have never had any trust with journalists. And for some of these communities, new students going out into the field are going to be building trust for the first time with these various groups. It's not just that sort of this mainstream sort of distrust has happened. It's that there's always been some problematics, in part because of the ways in which mainstream journalists have worked to cover different issues without really getting the kinds of perspectives they need, and they tend to fall into binaries and stereotypes. So I would suggest with students to try to learn how to talk to people who you might not look like or think like in particular, and that involves really kind of thinking differently about how we think about the watchdog role, which is something else that Rod just mentioned. I try to get my students to think that the watchdog role is not so much about making sure public officials aren't being scandalous in their job or that corruption isn't happening in government offices. It's that. But it's also that we have to watchdog these systems themselves. These systems are broken. They were made in part, and they were made fundamentally for white, male, propertied, literate people. That's their foundation, and those biases continue to stick as we have, a lot of white men who are still in power. And so I really suggest to students that they start questioning the structures themselves if they want to start creating trust in a lot of different kind of communities. So they can see where particularly Black and Brown communities and communities with disabled folks are coming from when they talk about bias, when they talk about systemic oppression and discrimination, that they know what they're talking about.
So I just want you to clarify, when you talk about playing a watchdog over the institutions, I think you said, can you, and systems, what do you mean by that?
I mean, so let's take a very realistic example, which is achievement disparities in K through 12 schools, right? That's something that almost every Cub reporter has to write about at some point, has to report on or produce on. And so what often happens is a report will come out, it'll talk about these disparities in the school district, you'll report on the report, you'll get a quote from the superintendent, you might get a quote from the community leader over at the Boys and Girls Club, and maybe you get some parents and some teachers. But really, I suggest instead that we look at where are those disparities coming from, right? So rather than talking about it as a problem between white students and Black and Brown students, that there's a gap there, there's obviously a systemic issue that's happening that is creating what some people have called an education debt, an opportunity debt for Black and Brown students that has caused those particular disparities. And so I suggest to students that you learn the histories, you talk to a lot of different people from Black and Brown communities themselves and just listen for a while, because particularly if you're a white person, you've grown up in K through 12 schools that have worked pretty well for you, right? But there's a whole other kind of different set of experiences for different groups. And so part of this is like saying, okay, is there problematic with the system, and what can my reporting do to highlight that and start creating change and disrupting those structures.
I want to expand quickly on what Sue said. She's absolutely right, because that really delves into the issue of providing more context for readers. And by doing that, you will provide a much more credible news report, because in our community of Memphis, again, we're about half of the community we cover is African American, and the city itself is 63%. What they consistently say to us is that you don't do coverage that helps us understand the why. We know what's happening, but we don't understand why it's happening, and you aren't proposing solutions on how to deal with the why. So I think on the achievement gap and other stories like that, environmental stories, business stories, we have to go beyond what happened in order to explain why it happened and explain how these systems work and hold people accountable for fixing the systems.
I do want to encourage everyone to look at the link that we sent out to a guide that Sue put together. It is a very detailed guide, and it's extremely helpful. I looked over it and I saw things that reminded me of my approach when I was a reporter, and things that Sue is suggesting that we do that it didn't occur to me at that time. That's probably the best document that I've seen to help guide people on efforts that you can make individually. And that's the key. These are things that you can do as a beginning reporter or senior reporter in your own world to help rebuild trust. Sue also touched on coverage of communities of color, and we had a session on that specific topic. It was a very interesting discussion. I had hoped that Sunnie could join that for a bit, because I've read some of the work that she's been doing, and I know, Sunnie, that you have a passion about trying to help how to appropriately cover the Native communities and Indigenous people. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I think that for things, it's in a sense a little bit different for me, because I've mostly covered within my own community. And so, and just to kind of piggyback a little bit of the previous discussion of really just knowledge making and understanding of communities, I think it's important to know for students as well that even though you are getting some information or being informed about a community, it's important to know that there's also diversity within those communities. And so with the Navajo community in particular, we are a very large, we have a very large demographic. The reservation spans into 3 states. And so we have divisions: Arizona Navajos, we have New Mexico Navajos, and there's even a such thing as Utah Navajos. And so everyone kind of has a different way of thinking. And there's even thoughts in terms of the language having different dialects. And so, so there are differences within those communities. And that's something that I also have to keep in mind when reporting in my own community, is that not everyone grows up the same kind of Navajo that I do. And so, so there are differences within communities, and covering stories within your own community is not very easy. I think that a lot of people think that it might be because you have a foot in the door, and that's true to some extent, but there are a lot of patches that you kind of have to run into, and which I essentially ran into with the last story that I wrote, which is pretty much a column about hungry elders in the Navajo community and holding leaders accountable for that, for those issues that they're facing. And so that was a difficult thing to do, because I love where I come from. I love my community. I love the people in my community. So it was hard to reveal this truth that's been a long truth that's really held up for many years. So, so one of the takeaways I would say or offer to students is that even when covering those communities and informing yourselves, it's also good to know that there are diversities within those specific communities.
Okay. I just want to you mentioned your story about the Navajo elders. The story that you did, you took an approach that I wouldn't think to do if I were covering that story. Can you just tell us a little details of how do you go and gain trust within your community when you're writing about Navajo people or issues?
I think that one of the things that really helped me was the fact that I didn't go in thinking that this was all that much surprising. In the column, I mentioned that this is an issue that I was well aware of, but it also helped that I spoke the language. And I know that not everyone can do that, but a lot of all of the people I spoke to's first language was Navajo. And so I had that going for me. So in the Navajo community, there's a lot more trust given to those who can speak to that demographic within that, their own language. And so for me, I introduced myself to the individuals. I didn't jump into the fact that I was a journalist. I was just having a conversation with them about what was happening with the pandemic, what their thoughts were, all things that did not make the column. We spent a good amount of time just sitting there and talking. And anyone who knows Navajo elders knows that they like to talk, they like to share stories, and they like to just visit and see where you come from. And so I made sure that I allowed for time for that. I spent 2 days doing a lot of this groundwork and spent a lot of time sitting with these elders. So I think just establishing some kind of relationship with them. I mean, we are generations apart, but I was able to sit there and share a laugh or two with them at times during a very hard time. And so really just bringing that human aspect, I think, is what allowed for that trust to happen and to build.
I've seen Sue nod in her head, and she's probably thinking the same that I'm thinking, is that as you're talking, Sunnie, I'm thinking back to the list that we just sent out of a guide, and you touched on several of the things that Sue has in that guide. Is that what the nods are for, Sue?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echo everything that Sunnie just said, because I think a big part of this for individual journalists and would-be journalists is understanding that they each have their own identities, right? And I think that's a given for a lot of our journalists of color. They already know they have those identities, but I find that a lot of my white students don't really recognize that they are white. And that they have a race, and that race is very visible to the sources that they want to cultivate. And that immediately there are going to be some assumptions about who they are and how they think that journalists have to sort of understand and navigate in the articulations of what the story is and what the story is about. And I love the idea that Sunnie's talking about of listening, right? Of just going and listening and having a conversation and reminding each other of their shared humanity before you just start interrogating with questions, particularly
Right.
if you're among community members that do not share your dominant identities.
Right. It's a way of establishing trust. You don't just go and just start demanding answers from people. You go and you try to build relationships. And I don't know, I'm assuming, but you can correct me, Sunnie, that you had built relationships with various people in the community, and that when they came there, that was not the first time many people had seen you. Would that be the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this community is probably about a good hour and 15 minutes from where I grew up. And if you live on the reservation, you know that that's quite a ways. I mean, that's a whole different demographic or a whole group of Navajo people. And so these were people I'd never met in my life. And I've met a lot of Navajo people in my lifetime, especially in the older demographic. But, but I understood that those were things that were important to them. And I think another thing that helped me was I grew up very close with my grandmother. So that helped me see what would be important to this demographic of people, this group of people. What do they value? And I think another important aspect is, what do they see when they see me? What do they assume about me, and what are their experiences with people like myself? And so when you have outsiders who come into the community, I, for one, already know how people in that generation would look at them and what it is that they might want. And so even though I was a member of that community, in a sense, I had to convince them that I was someone that they could trust. And so using all of those techniques and just, in my opinion, traditional elements of journalism is really what allowed for that trust to happen.
The Native American Journalists Association has put together several guides on different aspects of covering Native communities. And we have a link that people can go and look at some of those guides. Mark, I have a question for you, but did you have something that you wanted to add to this conversation?
Well, I was going to say that those are all very good points, and I think Sunnie sort of said it toward the very end that some of this is basic elemental journalism tactics, and one of them is when you listen, you learn, and also when you listen, you also get a sense of shared kind of shared interests, and by learning about shared interests, you can build rapport with people very quickly. Usually, sometimes takes more time than others. And I would say for the students involved here, depending on the kind of interview you're doing, there's lots of ways to get background information on people before you actually talk to them. LinkedIn is one really good way to get background on somebody professionally. So when you show up, you know a little bit of something about them before you ever get there. Because it is true, you want to build that rapport very quickly.
I did a 6-month study in Casper, Wyoming last year, dealing with media trust, where we brought in 36 people and talked to them regularly over those 6 months. And we had some presentations from people talking about journalism and how they do their jobs. And much like this webinar, there were different topics that we discussed every day, but there was a lot of opportunity for feedback from the people there. One of the things that I said in the report is that it's very important that if you want to build trust within a community, that needs to start at the top. It has to be somebody in charge has to want to do that and lead the charge on carrying that out. And so, Mark, you are a top editor. You are the highest journalist in your newsroom. You are the executive there. And so I'm saying that you have to set the tone for this. Now, what are you doing in your role as a top editor to try to endear trust and regain trust from the communities that you serve?
It's a very good point. I would say there are several things I've tried to do in my 3 years as editor. Among them is build in more transparency, explain our practices journalistically, and particularly when we make a mistake, sometimes I write a column about that mistake to explain what happened and why we're going to try and prevent it from happening again. I think it's important for readers to know that we're all human. We make mistakes from time to time, but we have to come clean when we make those mistakes and explain what happened and how it happened. The other thing we have to do is understand that there are many readers who don't really know what we do and don't even understand the difference between opinion and news. So to the extent that we in our business, and I try and do this as an editor, explain to people an opinion writer is in this particular section of Viewpoint or has this particular logo with their story and has the word opinion above it. News writers are different. News analysis is in the middle and may include some interpretation of the news, but it is not straight opinion. I think that's important to explain to readers because they don't really understand what we do. And the last thing I'll say is that to the extent that we can do this, we have to be able to sometimes raise the curtain on our practices and explain what we do. And sometimes it can be as simple as explaining why we don't have a story in the paper the next day that happened the night before because our deadlines are too early. People don't understand that. When you can explain those kind of things to people, they better understand our business and we gain more credibility.
I want to point you to two other resources. There's an organization called trustingnews.org. And they've done, I don't know if you've worked with them before, Mark, in your newsroom, but what trustingnews.org does, on their website, they have examples of what newsrooms have done to try to rebuild trust. So I encourage people to go to that trustingnews.org. Also, our sponsor, the Trust Project, what they're doing is trying to help people understand what's going on in the background with stories so you can judge the trustworthiness of it, such as who wrote it, who are these people who are writing it, and things like that. So you can go to the Trust Project website as well to get
Hey, Rod,
they have there. Go ahead.
I want to mention one other quick thing I didn't mention earlier, And that is that engaging with readers is important too. And I've tried to do that in my 3 years as editor here. Meet readers on their own turf, take reporters out to communities, talk to folks about what they experience, where they live. I think it's important that they view us as not people sitting behind the walls of a newsroom downtown, that we're viewed as part of the community. And I think right now it's hard to do that because of coronavirus. So we're doing a lot of these things via Zoom and via digital platforms. But I think there'll come a time in the future where we can do this again. And to the extent that we can get out in communities and talk to folks about issues, I think it makes us more trustworthy and more credible.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that because I think it's also important to recognize that if you're working for a newsroom or particular news brand in a community, you need to break out of their regular audience. And that, you know, I consult with a lot of newsrooms, and sometimes they'll say, oh, we really want to engage with citizens and community members. And so we created this forum or this live chat or something, and we didn't get that many participants. You know, we got kind of the same people showing up. And I asked, well, how did you market that? I mean, it's almost always they market it through their existing listserv or on their website. But I'm suggesting that any journalist needs to find informants or community leaders who can serve as bridges into different kinds of communities that are not aware of the work that the brand has been doing, right? So I think that's part of it too, is that editors and journalists get very defensive when community members say, we never see ourselves in your coverage. And they're like, well, I just did 3 stories about X, Y, and Z. And you have to understand that those community members haven't seen those stories. They stopped reading you like 10 years ago. And so this is also part of this trust work, is trying to expand the numbers of people who know about your work as a journalist and know about the brand's work as well.
Sue makes a good point. I want to pick up on something real quick because I think it's relevant to what she said. We did a session several months ago at a church here in Memphis, a Baptist church, and I struggled with how to get the audience to come to the church for the session, which is going to be a community session in South Memphis. And I thought, I got to get a little bold here. So I went to the minister of the church and said, I want to do 3 things. I want you to put this on your Facebook page for the church. I want you also to put it in the memo for the church on Sunday. But then more importantly, I knew this was the boldest of ask of all, but he said yes to it. I want you to let me appear on the 2 Sundays before the session to make an announcement when you make the church announcement so the church members will hear it. And that actually generated the biggest audience we've had for a session, about 100 people.
Okay, there's been a lot going on this year. It's been the news a year. You know, we have a pandemic, we have an economy that has left over 30 million people unemployed. We have an election, and we've had protests over systemic racism within policing and the criminal justice system. When we started out with the coronavirus, I thought that was going to be a good opportunity for the press to rebuild trust, because newspapers and TV stations and radio stations would be putting out, and websites, news sites would be sending out information that's really helpful to guide you through this pandemic, right? And I think there has been some very good reporting about that, but this whole issue got politicized, and now people are in 2 different camps about certain aspects of the pandemic.
Even the issue of where they wear a mask.
Right. So I'm just wondering, is there still an opportunity for us as journalists to use this moment of so much going on with the things that I mentioned, the economy, the protests, the election coming up, and the pandemic? Is there still an opportunity for journalists to become more important to people's lives and how they cover these issues, and win back some of the people who abandoned them. Do you see any hope for that, Sue?
I'm a pretty big optimistic person when it comes to the future of journalism.
Do not do that. Go back. I'm sorry.
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. And I actually would really like to hear how Sunnie's doing her work in the pandemic. I'm curious how she does that, knowing that she, the best, most effective manner is to go out and to talk to people and to listen. How do you do that when you really can't go out anymore because you'd be putting a lot of people at risk? Is one question I had. But to get back to Rod's question, which is that I think the pandemic is a really stressful time for everybody, and we have to understand that. It can be difficult to get people on the phone or on a FaceTime call or a Zoom call. On the other hand, I think it's an important time for journalists to be out there and listening and making those connections that Mark was talking about, right? Like I'm hoping Mark already had a relationship with that guy, the Reverend, and that's why he let you do that. When I asked a similar question of one of our local reverends, he said no, because I hadn't built any trust with him or any of his constituency, and he was right. And I got really defensive, and I had to make sure that I repaired that and built trust with him just by being present and talking to him and doing some work on the side, doing some quid pro quo stuff in order for me to build that trust. So I think this is an opportunity now where we can do some of that work because there's so much crisis. So I'll just stop talking now, and I'd love
Okay.
Sunnie.
Well, Sunnie is the reporter on the panel today, and I'm just wondering, have you, Sunnie, had thoughts about how covering some of these issues might help bring back the trust? Do you see it as an opportunity like that?
I absolutely do, just because I think of, and I always go with personal experiences and knowledge that I have in terms of the coverage that I do right now. And excuse me, I see that a lot of people more than ever are curious about what is happening throughout the rest of the world. And so to me, that means that we're up to bat in a sense in giving them that information that they're craving and that they've wanted. And I think that with a lot of the issues that are happening in connection with the pandemic, it allows for us to give them the truths that they've been perhaps wanting from the media for a very long time. And I say that because I look at my parents as an example. They're not really consumers of news, but then the pandemic happened and now they crave it. They want that information. They are looking for the appropriate resources to steer them the right way through navigating through this pandemic. And so I think now more than ever, it's absolutely an opportunity to be able to do that. And I can address Sue's question as well about, exactly how I'm doing this. It's interesting because a lot of people in the specifically the Navajo community are very untrusting of anyone from the outside. And so I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with CNN and kind of the big shots coming into the reservation and reporting on what's been happening there, especially during the last, I think, couple of months or a month and a half or something, where we had just this huge surge of national media coming into the reservation. That was difficult to watch to an extent because I already knew how the people would perceive those coming in, and just looking at them as people who would come in this one time and then we'd never see them again. And so that was a distrust that they already had. But I think that's why it made it so important for me to do ground reporting. I actually have been doing field reporting where I'm able to do phone interviews and online interviews and things like that. I do that, but I don't think that I can do my job best unless I'm physically able to do it. And so for these elder interviews, every elder in the story,
I actually interviewed in person. And so we set up the interviews where they were done outside or at the discretion of the people being interviewed. So I let them make that decision of whether or not they wanted to do this in person. And a lot of them wanted to do it in person because they had hearing issues, or they just didn't trust you and wanted to see you face to face. And so that made the most sense for them. So I took a chance and made that happen because it was what they wanted. I listened to the sources, and that was, again, part of building that trust, was listening to what they preferred and what really was best I knew in terms of getting the story. And so, so I think that it might be a little bit different in that case, but that was also a choice I made. I mean, Searchlight, the organization I work for, made it an option, said do interviews. And I said, when it comes to my community, when it comes to these people, that's just not much of an option unless they say that that's what they want. And so I think that that was more of a particularly specific instance where I had to do field reporting.
Okay. There's a story that that broke on Sunday in Kenosha, Wisconsin. A young man, Jacob Blake, was shot in the back by police there. And when I, as I read the story here, of course, I thought back to the story of George Floyd, who was killed by a police officer by pressing his knee on his neck and basically suffocating him. And of course, there've been a lot of coverage of these police killings of Black men in the past. The thing that, when I look at some of the coverage, and you read the comments, and even if you see comments made on social media, there are like two different voices out there. You have people who are saying, there's systemic racism in policing, and something needs to be done about it. And then, you have this group saying, well, let's defund the police and redirect some of the funds and do policing differently. And then you also have voices of saying, one such, in this case, incident, kid, the young man was not killed. I don't know about, well, he wasn't immediately killed. I think he's still alive. But anyway,
yeah.
But anyway, so in it's like you hear people saying that this is not an incident that's indicative of racism, let alone systemic racism. And the conversation, there's a lot of defensiveness that I hear and read. And so the thing that's clear is that some people come to stories like this from different perspectives. In one of the sessions that we had in Casper, one of the presenters said that you have to keep in mind that people bring their own biases to stories. So I'm just wondering, is there like some kind of way that you can report on the initial story about a young man being shot in the back, and then a broader story about police shootings and the possibility of systemic racism, and do it in a way that people accept what is true? I mean, I don't know that people seem to be coming from two different directions. So how do you bridge this? How can our reporting be honest and both sides see it as honest? Does that make sense, Mark?
It makes sense. And I think that it's important that we always do that and provide context and explain what's happening. But I fear that because of the partisan divide, we're not at the point where we're ever going to get some people to accept that the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, the killing of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and the shooting death and the shooting of Mr. Blake is something that really speaks to a larger systemic problem with police departments and bad cops. I think there's this point now where we're disagreeing over whether to wear a mask. We are. So I think it's hard to get to the point where I think we're going to find we do stories that everyone will agree this is a story that comes down in a fair way. I think it's going to be hard to do that.
Mm-hmm. So you have thoughts about this? The coverage of stories like this?
Yeah, I do. And one of the things I think is important for us to realize is that each one of these stories, there's a person behind the story, and we have to be able to tell the stories of the people. And that's one of the reasons the George Floyd story, I think, became, well, not only that the image itself was so disconcerting and so violent that it caused people to take action, but they also understood a little bit more about him and how he was trying to turn around his life. And I think stories like that, we have to get behind the person and tell a little bit about who they are and what happened to them. And I think hold the police accountable for what they're doing. I think that's an important aspect of it.
So, you have some thoughts on stories like this?
Yeah, no, I concur with what Mark is saying. And then I'd also add that I think that journalists are in a unique position to bring some of these polarizing sides together and have some of these community conversations, hopefully in person at some point someday. And I'm seeing a lot more of this work happening, where journalists themselves are kind of trying to moderate, you know, these different sides and these different kinds of ideas and perspectives. And this is, you know, there's a ton of media trust initiatives going on right now. Like there's one in, I can't remember where it is, but I think it's Virginia made it. It's Ask A ... And they bring in like a police officer, and then the police officer sort of is asked a lot of questions from people. Or they bring in, you know, a trans person, and that person is asked a lot of questions. And just, you know, I think journalists have this neutral territory that they can utilize to help communities move forward on some of these really intractable issues.
Well, one of the things that Mark's mentioned was the political polarization. And in one of the sessions we had here, we had someone from the Pew Center for Research talking about how whether people trust the news can be linked to their political ideology. People who identify as conservative or Republican tend to trust the mainstream news less, and people who are more liberal, Democrats, trust it more. And to confuse things, you have network news stations that cater to your political ideology. And so I'm just wondering, with people being so polarized and everything is filtered through politics, you know, how do you cut through that? And there is, and the mainstream news media have been linked to the liberals and the Democratic Party. So when they see you as a representative of the press, they also see you as someone who is liberal and probably a Democrat. And it is a fact that most journalists are Democrats. But so I'm assuming and I'm hopeful that despite this, a journalist still has standing to go out there and tell a truthful story that people can trust. But how do you cut through the polarization and people looking at you saying, I know your perspective, because the press is on the side of Democrats, and you have a president who makes that accusation very publicly? Who can address that? How do we solve that problem? Sunnie?
That's a big problem. That's a huge problem. But I think going back to something we've already talked about, I think the issue of transparency is important. Labeling what we do is very important, whether it's a column or whether it's a news story. And I think particularly watchdog journalism, we have to keep doing that and do it in a way that helps people understand the why of why something is happening and help them get a better sense of the context of what's happening in our communities. I think that's one way to help bridge the gap in terms of the trust gap, if you will.
I mean, we need to be sensitive of how we cover stories. Let me ask you this question. The New York Times this morning has a story about, well, it has several stories about the Republican National Convention, right?
Yep.
And it has a headline that says, Trump nominated as GOP delivers ominous message, okay? And so I heard somebody talking about that characterization as ominous. I mean, we had you know, a convention that was several days long, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have this headline that's trying to capture something that took days. Now, is it fair to say in a headline that at the top of the New York Times that the GOP message was ominous? Now, there were people who were saying in their speeches that if you elect Joe Biden, you know, there's going to be all of this bad stuff is going to happen. And I'm not expressing opinion about here. I didn't watch much of the convention. But my question is, how do you capture something that's multiple hours in a headline? Is it safer to not even try? I mean, because whatever you come up with can be disputed because because there have been exceptions to whatever you say. And another example of this is the coverage of protests. There are all the protests that have been happening this summer. They start off peaceful. Some of them toward the end of the night. There were some in several cities where there was, you know, something was set afire. There was clashes with the police, and that's the headline. An event that may have lasted several hours of the day, mostly peaceful, and the images that you see and the stories that you read talk about, you know, the last 2 hours when things were set afire. Never mind. So how do you cover a multiple hour event and accurately capture what happened without opening yourself for people to say that you're being biased?
I'll
Sunnie?
start.
Wait, let me let Sunnie
Sure. Go ahead, Sunnie. My bad.
thought about that since she's the reporter here. Have you been in these situations where you try to capsulize something that went on for hours?
The only thing I can think of in terms of my coverage is there was a time, I think 5 years ago, we had something happen called the Gold King mine spill. And that's when the uranium, there was a spill from a mine in Colorado that ran through the reservation. And there was a lot of different things going on. There was the local leadership and how they were reacting to everything. There was the EPA that was involved. There was the Navajo Nation government on the higher level. There were so many different things. And in terms of whose fault this was and exactly what was going to happen. And I think that the main thing that I can say to how someone handles this is really just being as informed as possible. I think that that's the most that you can do in terms of reporting on something where there's just so much going on. And in that case, I had to be informed. I mean, I went to meetings or to gatherings of some sort where perhaps that wasn't necessarily my focus, but I knew that it had played a big part in what the overall situation was. And so just really being as informed as possible and listening to anything that anyone will really tell you, because there were times where I didn't know certain things were happening, but other people did. And so I allowed myself that opportunity to learn from others about what was happening, because I'd never covered something like this before. And I was a person who was closest, so I was given that job to cover the Gold King mine spill because it happened in my backyard. And so there was a lot that I did not know. News was not my coverage area. I was a sports writer at the time. So the best thing that I could have done and that I did was being informed, talking with other reporters, being in touch with people in the community. And so I think that's the best thing that you can do, because you can't be everywhere at the same time. However, you can get as much information as you possibly can in doing your homework, essentially.
Sure. Yeah. I want to get in a couple of questions that people have asked. When it comes to objectivity, it seems like when it comes to stories like Jacob Blake and George Floyd, so So we not as journalists have do we not as journalists have a responsibility to point out the systemic racism and the wrongness of the shootings of Black and brown people? Mark?
If I understand the question correctly, it's whether we as journalists have an obligation to point out systemic racism. We're doing a story about George Floyd,
Right.
about Mr. Blake. And
Yeah.
I think the issue there is that in the initial news story, I think it's appropriate to point out that this is among a series of these shootings that have happened over a certain time, and point out that these shootings have sparked protests throughout the nation because of issues of systemic racism, social injustice. I think there's also a time where we can do a step back story to do a broader piece, more contextual, that puts it in a better context.
Okay. Do any media outlets have a devil's advocate role for the editor to point out articles that would appear to many consumers as partisan or bordering on being agenda-sized opinion piece, one-sided presentation of a situation, but purported to be straightforward and factual news? This is an accusation that we heard a lot in Casper, that the stories are masquerading as news when they are really opinion. And this devil's advocate, that used to be the ombudsman,
Right.
At some newspapers and organizations, somebody who is an advocate for the public and challenges things. The unfortunate thing that's happening through the contraction of the employees of these companies is that that role has virtually disappeared. A lot of news organizations no longer have that person. They got lost in the cuts. But so yeah, there is the ombudsman that used to be, there's still some around, let me point that out, but they're not nearly as prevalent as they were. But on the other part of the question about stories that seem to convey an agenda, how do you deal with that accusation? And is it a real thing? I mean, is it true that news organizations are writing and reporting and producing stories that carry a bias, either of that they hold a clear bias, an intentional bias that they hold, or that is the agenda of the news organization?
I'll take a quick stab at this because I get this complaint a lot in my role as editor, and usually it is revolving around a columnist. And I have to explain to people that a columnist is paid to state their opinion. That's their job, to state their opinion. And I don't find that this complaint about reporters tends to be appropriate. And I find that when I look at those kind of stories, that pretty much is someone who is viewing the story through their own prism. And they're seeing in it things they want to see because they have a particular point of view.
Yeah, but there are people who say that there is opinion in the reporting. It's not just columnists. Well, here's an unfortunate thing.
Yeah.
A lot of times when reporters make mistakes, being human, they will.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the level of distrust, people view that mistake as intentional.
Right.
If the mistake sort of suggested, some position that a suspicious person would say, oh, you're just carrying out the agenda of your publisher or your own bias, So it's very difficult to even make a mistake in this business. But the allegation is that, and I hear it a lot, that headlines carry bias. The words that you choose show your bias. And I think that there's some legitimacy to that. But the question is it intentional? That's the question that I have. But do any of you see this type of trying to sway people to your point of view in news columns as a widespread thing?
Say that I look at a lot of journalism through the years, through my research, and it's never intentional. I mean, of course, everybody has bias, and journalists need to understand where their biases are coming from. Otherwise, those biases will eke into their copy. And sometimes that does happen, but I don't think it's ever intentional. Every journalist I've ever talked to, I could be biased myself because I was a former journalist. So I just have never seen that, that lust for an agenda that journalists get accused of so often. I'm just gonna make one other point, which is going back to the trust issue. So if you break down some of those polls that you're talking about, Rod, in fact, if a person knows personally a reporter or their particular local news station, they have a lot more trust for that person or that local news station than when people are talking about like cable news, MSNBC or CNN or Fox. And so I think it's important for young journalists to understand that the more they get out, the more people they talk to who hold different ideologies than them, who hold different identities than them, then they're gonna build trust with every single person that they talk to. And I think that's one way to start trying to counteract these constant accusations about agendas.
Okay. We are getting toward the end of our time here, unfortunately. So before we end, I do want to give, keep in mind that we're not just wrapping up a session, we're wrapping up a series here. And so I want each of you to give some thought about what we can leave with students about their power and their ability to join in this effort to try to bring back people. I do want to again stress that you should go to the link that Sue, to the list, the guide that Sue put together, because you will get a lot of things there that you as a journalist can actually do. So let's start with Sunnie. Anything that you want to leave the students with about what they can do to, what's like some of the main things?
Well, definitely going back to what I mentioned before about, just listening and taking the time to build a relationship, I think is something that might be a little bit lost in journalism nowadays. And I know that there are deadlines and there are things like that, but that leaves you with the creativity to figure out what is the best way to do that, to spend that extra time making sure that you can build that trust with your source or your sources. And then I think something Mark mentioned about transparency, where he talked about, explaining headlines and what opinion pieces are. I take it upon myself as a reporter to take it a step farther and give a little bit of media literacy to some people who are sources. And I have to do that a lot on the reservation because we have but only maybe the Navajo Times and then 2 other border town newspapers. And so there's really only one media outlet on the Navajo Nation. And so a lot of people don't understand exactly how we operate as an organization or how Navajo Times operated as an organization. And so I take that extra step to let people know this is what's going to happen next. And this is the process that it's going to go through. And so I think that that's also something to consider, is because I think a lot of times when people don't really know how things work, that's when they think that you're intentionally trying to get something out of them and using it for your benefit or for the organization's benefit. And so I also take that extra step in terms of providing some media literacy in terms of how things operate in a news from a journalistic stance. And then checking in. I mean, it's a really simple thing, but also something that takes a little bit of time. But I wrote a piece that came out, I believe, in late May, and I still check in with those sources because I genuinely care and let them know that I care about what it is that they're going through because it was pandemic related. And so I follow up with those sources and make sure that I maintain that relationship. And I think that that's something that we're definitely missing still. I mean, in journalism, we go in and we are definitely there for a reason, but we should also show that if we do in fact care about who these people are and the value of the knowledge that they have, then we should definitely show that. And so those are some of the things that I had written down, and really just the small things. I mean, That's something I learned in Journalism 101 more than 10 years ago, and it's something that I stick by.
Okay, Sue?
I would say expand your personal networks, read on social justice issue, understand what disabilities means, go out of your way to go to a different grocery store or church, or expand your social network. And all of that is going to lend perspective and allow you to build trust in different kinds of communities.
It also seems to me that it would build an authenticity to your reporting, that you come with some knowledge that you've gained by talking to a lot of different people. All right, thanks, Sue. And Mark?
You actually took the words right out of my mouth when you mentioned authenticity, because I was going to emphasize that one of the ways that you can kind of better connect with communities and better connect with people is to understand them better and to put yourself out there in terms of, I don't know much about your community, I don't know much about your issue, but I want to understand it better. And then listen carefully, listen closely. And then as Sunnie mentioned, keep going back to those folks after you write your story to check in with them, because things change. Things change for people, issues change, and the follow-up story is very critical to do in our business.
Okay, so thank you, Mark, Sue, and Sunnie. And also thanks to the Trust Project, our sponsor for this series. I think that we had some really good discussions here, and we do have a link where you can go back and watch the ones that you missed. That's in the chat, I believe. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and hopefully we'll do something like this again. So thanks.
Thanks for inviting us, Rod.
Thanks,
Sure.
SPJ.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice meeting you, Sunnie and Sue.
Nice meeting you.